Well, hello and welcome to the Alpha Anywhere demo and Q&A webcast. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Product Management here at Alpha Software. I'm pleased to present today Dion McCormick, no relations, who is an Alpha expert and is here today to talk to you about list controls. Also joining us is Sarah Mitchell, our Director of Customer Success and Head of our Documentation Department. So while Dion does his presentation, don't forget you can always enter questions into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. Also, as a reminder, you could send us questions to guides, GUIDES, at alphasoftware.com. All right, let's get started. Dion, I already see your screen. So, hey, how's it going?
Might help to unmute.
It does.
Good to meet little technologically challenged. You'd think after all these couple years of Zooming, you'd get used to that, but still making those rookie mistakes. But anyway, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us. And as Dave mentioned, we are here for you. So if you do have questions about my presentation, please go into the Q&A section and put your questions there. They'll be monitoring them. Also, if you have an idea for a webinar or information that you're looking for, etc., you can always email us at guides@alphasoftware.com, and we use that to kind of drive the content for our weekly webinars. So we'd love to have you, give us some guidance on what you would like to see, and we will do our best to help you on that in that situation. So as Dave mentioned, today's presentation has to do with the list control. And the list control is a insanely important control in the Alpha universe. It is really powerful, has an enormous amount of capabilities, can be used in many different ways. And so we're just going to touch on those, but also we really want to focus on the fact that if you're going to do a offline application with Alpha Anywhere, the list control is really your go-to tool to be able to pull off offline applications. And the nice thing is it does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So, and I'll touch on that as I go through the presentation. I think you'll see that it's really a lot of it's built into it. In fact, it is a patented technology based on some of the cool features that were put into the system by the development team at Alpha Software. So today what I'd like to do is talk about what the list control does, show you a little demonstration, putting together one, and then talking about some of the different aspects that are involved with the list control. Again, it's sort of like a meta control because it can do many, many different things and has many, many different ways to approach things. And it really gives you just a whole laundry list of things you can pick and choose from to make your solutions work exactly the way you want to. So, the key thing about the list control is, and sometimes it's a little confusing for new people, is that a list control actually does two things at one time. First is it manages data, meaning it connects to a backend data source or local. It depends on how you want to do it, but most likely it's a backend data source. It understands how to connect to that, get the information, maintain that information, and then update that information back on the back end. So that is all built into the fabric of the list control, but it also can do visual representation. So in this case, it allows you to set up the display of the information in yours. And what's amazing about the list control is that the breadth of the different types of displays are enormous. And I'm going to touch on a few of those today in terms of how you want to represent that data to the person. And the list control and what the fundamental data management is, basically think of it as a set of records. So you bring a set of records into the list control, and then the list control then allows you to display it in multiple different ways. In fact, the same list control can have multiple different representations of the display of that data. But again, we'll talk more about it. Underlying it, it allows you to edit that data and send that information back to the original source. I'm going to talk a little bit about the list control versus the grid control, kind of the history of that. And then also we're going to touch on the offline capabilities of the list control. And I'll go through and just do a quick setup and walkthrough of it and answer any of your questions about that. So I do want to touch on a list control versus a grid. So Alpha has had the grid component in there for a long, long, long time. It's one of our most mature components. It does something very similar in terms of it is a control that connects to a backend data source, gathers that information, will manage that data and present it to the user in a very nice way. There are ways to modify the look and feel of that display. But there's some fundamental issues around the grid control that caused the development team to stop and say, we need to go back to the drawing board and really start over. And a couple of benefits for the list control before we get into the differences is that it is easy to use, very, very simplistic. It is solid and dependable. It has been hammered on for years and years and years. So you put it together and you can style it, but the styling is a bit limited. And again, I think the benefit of the grid control is you drop it in and you're done very quickly. But there are some specific drawbacks to using the grid control. Thus, more and more solutions are being used in the list. So first and foremost, the grid control is not built to be used offline. It's built to be connected to a backend database and display that information, allow you to interact with that. It does that very, very well. But if you need to be able to use it offline, you're kind of at a no-go situation because the grid control depends on that connectivity to a backend database. It is a much lighter control. The list control is much lighter than the grid control. If you want to put together a very simplistic list control, it's not going to take up very much space when you download it onto the client machine. So it loads faster, operates faster, just easier to manage from that overall standpoint. The list control is from the get-go a responsive control. So it is built for the mobile environment. And by that, I mean mobile phones, mobile tablets, or even desktops. I mean, it's usable in all three environments. But what's important, it's responsive, so it can kind of relay itself out on any of those specific environments automatically for you. And you have a lot of control over how that happens. So you can actually tune it to say, if you're on a phone, look like this. If you're on a tablet, look like this. If you're on the desktop, there. So again, from the get-go, the team said, hey, we want to make sure we can handle these new mobile devices, at that time very new. So they included those capabilities. And it is a much more modern structured entity and also has more of a modern look and feel out of the gate. And it has an enormous amount of styling capabilities, meaning not only are the root styles nicer and easy to change, colors and other pieces there, but the styling of how it actually, the user interacts with it is completely customizable by the user. The grid control is online, a little heavier, not as responsive, not as ability on styling. But again, it is a good, easy control to use. So I'm not saying don't use it, but just realize you're going to have certain limitations you'll run into using the grid control from there. So to really kind of explore this and show you some of these capabilities, I want to go ahead and build a list control, kind of talk about how we do that, and then go through a couple of the different things. Now, one of the things I do want to show you is that there is a kind of a quick setup. We'll do that first, just to show you how fast you can create a very fast, easy to use environment. It's got some genies built into it, but then I kind of want to go back and do it manually just to show you some of the ins and outs of that. And as I go through this presentation, I highly recommend, if you have questions, jump over to the GoToWebinar control panel, go into your questions, put them there. Dave will monitor them, interrupt me, and if we needed, we'll stop and go over those and make sure you have a good, clear understanding of how the list control works.
In
So
fact,
I'm going to pop into my
I'll interrupt you right now, Dion.
Oh,
Thank
no,
you for the
please do.
invitation.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, good transition. I love it. So someone asked about the list control. They said, can list control work offline using a computer? So in other words, not on a mobile device.
Yes, you can do that. Yep.
Okay. That was easy.
It's fully set. Now, just realize there are certain limitations by the data and stuff like that. And we can talk a little bit about that in terms of the endpoint. Just because mobile devices, depends on how you deploy your app on the mobile device, whether it's in the web browser or on the native on the device, which we support both of those. Again, if you go through the web browser, there's certain inherent limitations we'll touch on a little later in terms of the amount of data and other things that you can do. Once you're native, you have access to the file system and things like that. So great question. I'll kind of put a pin in it and come back to that in a little bit from that standpoint.
Thanks.
But keep those coming. We want those questions. Again, those questions are super valuable because I'm sure someone else was thinking something similar or leads them in the direction they want to go. So I'm in the alpha development environment. I'm using the full development versus community edition. So there may be some small minor differences between them. But what I'm going to show you here will work absolutely the same in both of them from that standpoint. So a a list control has to live within a UX. So a list control versus a grid is not a standalone component in the alpha world. If I were to create a grid, it creates a grid. I can then embed that grid in different places. But if you're going to do a list control, it has to be within a UX. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new UX. There are some really nice examples that you can use and put in here that are good to go. But I'm going to start with a blank one just because it is simple to do that. But you have other things like customer, simple, etc. Pretty simple stuff. So I'm going to open up a UX control, and we'll go ahead and go over to my add control here, which is how I add a control into it. And I'm going to type the word list. So you'll see it comes up at the very top. I'm going to say add the list control. So by the way, if you're new, it might have shown up like this. This is just a mode if you're going to add a single control. There's also a mode for creating multiple new controls to be able to do it at the same time. Now, I could create a list control and then go through and manually configure it, but I highly recommend if you haven't done stuff with list controls that you start with what I'm going to do next, because what it will do is it will kickstart and do a lot of the grunt work for you so that you don't have to worry about it. And then you can go back in and kind of learn the ins and outs of the details of it. So you'll see, I'm going to go ahead and put in a list control. I'll go list of customers. And you'll see down below, there is a button that's become active, list control dash quick setup Genie. So the Genie is there for you. It's basically a step-by-step process that kind of makes some assumptions and guides you through the process, so you don't have to go dig out exactly where everything is. So I'm going to go ahead and use that for our process here. So again, I put in the name of the control, and again, remember you can have more than one list control on a UX, which is very powerful because you could literally be managing different types of data on a single UX, which is kind of handy. So I'm going to go ahead and click list control quick setup Genie. It now brings up my list builder. First and foremost right here, it's got some information here. Here are your different elements you can go to. It has a lot of data into it. But the first and foremost thing it does, which is from our standpoint, what most people do, is it opens up to say, listen, I need to connect to some data. What data do you want to connect to? And it's defaulted to a database connection. Now, the list data source I'm going to show you right now can be other things besides SQL, but I'm going to set it up for SQL, and then we'll go in and explore some of those other data sources because there's a couple that are really powerful, especially in this day and age. So the first thing I'm going to do is select my connection string. Now, when I set up my environment, I went ahead and created the default connection string to the Northwinds database. If you haven't seen that before, there's some good videos on how to do that, but I've already got that set up. So I'm going to click here, select my AA demo Northwind connection string, and click OK. Now it's asking me how I want to define my SQL query. I am going to do fields from a table, but you could do custom. It's really up to you, but I'm going to do fields from the table. So in that case, it's going to say, well, what table do I want to get the information from? So I'm going to select here and go to customers. And you can see when I open that up, it shows me all of my tables that are available within my database. So I might have many more than you see here on your regular database, but I'm going to select customers. Now it's asking me what fields I need to use, and like the alpha methodology, it lets me select those. Now what I'm going to do is go down here to the bottom, and I'm going to click select all. So I'm just going to have them bring back all the fields in the customer table from there. Now I'm not going to set it here, but you can filter data from that backend source, and that filter can be dynamic. I highly recommend you look at this because if you have a very, very large table, you don't necessarily want to bring back every record to your local machine because that could take a while. So you want to try and use filters a lot with lists just to kind of manage and keep the data set lower, makes everything work a little better from there. And you can order it too. Let's say I want to order it by company name. And so this is building up how it's going to connect from there. There's also some other options like distinct where you can select the distinct values. So if you have multiple you can do things like that. And the reality is it's just building a SQL query here that's going to call the database. And I can even test that and see what information is going to come back right here. So I go, yeah, that's exactly what I want in my list control. Now, the cool thing about the quick setup Genie is the following is remember, a list control both displays data, but also manages data and allows you to update data and synchronize data back. So you'll notice down here is once I've set up my connection, you'll see there's an area called detail view. So I'll open up there. Now I don't have to do this, but I want a detail view because that's how I'll actually edit the data. So I'm going to click detail view and enable that. Now it's asking me what fields. I'm going to say, I'll leave the defaults, all fields here. And there's some other like nice little, you can tweak things as you go through here. I'm not going to go through those in detail, but you can do that. There's a lot of control in here on how to do that. Now, the other thing that's nice too is that I can include a search part. So I do want to include a search part so I can search that data. So I'm going to go ahead and click Has Search Part. As you notice, as I select these items, it opens up other choices based on that. Now, the search type part, there's a selection here. It can either be individual, single word, or query by form. Individual controls is where I'll select, I want this field, this field, this field to create those fields for it. The second one is a single keyword control. That's the one I'm going to show you. That's the one I find is most easy to use. But then also query by form, which actually allows you to open up a form and fill it out and then use that to search. So it's a much more sophisticated, more granular search. But I'm going to keep it simple for our presentation here and say single keyword control. Now, when I do that, it's asking me, well, what fields do you want to search on? So in this case, I'm going to search on company name, contact name, even address, city. I can add any all I want from there. And therefore, when I put in a search term, those are the fields that are going to be searched when I do that from there. A couple other things here, delay populate list till active search. That means it'll open up without the data in the list. And then once you put the search term, you then load it. That's actually really nice if you want to minimize the amount of data because it opens very quickly. It doesn't actually call back to get the data and allows you to do that. So that's a really handy one if you have more of a, like instead of just showing people what's in there, you want to have a search function, select some records and do that from there. Okay, and then last but not least, I'm going to go down here and expand disconnected option. And that's the magic one. If I enable this, everything inside the list control is set up to pull the data down, manage it locally, and then update it back to the backend database and synchronize and all that. So by just clicking that one button, it's an enormous amount of functionality that's enabled that allow the person to do what they need, to do things offline. And that's really one of the magical aspects of the list control is that's built into the DNA of the list control. And I'm just going to enable it and use it and show you how that goes from there. So I've set up where I'm getting my data from, what data. I'm saying I want to use a detail view to edit that information. I want to have a search part and a disconnected operation. And I'm going to click OK. So the system is going to automatically generate all of my controls for me and put them on the screen. Now, very important, I'm going to be able to then modify it, but it did a lot of work. I didn't have to go and create all these form fields and do all these other things there. It was just like boom, 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 good to go. And in a moment, we will have a fully operational remote disconnected interface. So let me go ahead and save this. And I'm going to go list webinar UX. Okay. And I'm going to come back and explore these in a little more detail to show you what it actually built up. Let's just go ahead and go in and show you what it looks like right out of the gate. And to forewarn you, it's a little cluttered, but hey, it did a lot of the heavy lifting. Now I can focus on things. I'm going to do something real quick. You can notice it's already built my interface. I want to go in and I'm going to go to the properties here. And I'm using alpha blue gray. But I'd like to do is use the compact theme just so you can see more things on the screen. It's using the mobile theme, which is much bigger, but I want to use the compact theme there. That way you just see a little bit more data. Okay. So you'll notice in a moment, you'll see that we have a search form up top. We have our list control, which has all their data. You'll notice it already has called back and pulled that data in because I didn't specify I didn't want it to do that. And you'll notice down below, we have a detail form with some buttons here, including a new record button from there. So not only did it lay out all these things, but everything is wired up and ready to go. So for instance, if I click on Alfkey, watch what happens down here. You'll see that the interface, once it's selected, automatically integrated and selected that record into my detail form, populated the fields, and have everything ready to go for me. And that's dynamic. As I click these different items, it automatically connects and moves that forward in there. I can even go down here and select this one. So you don't have to worry about then writing code to say what record is selected here. The list control understands that there's a default or a detail view, and it does all the wiring for you, which is just an enormous time saver. And as I mentioned before, it set up my search parameters. So let's go ahead and do lonesome. So I'm typing the word L-O-N-E, and I see down here, where is that? Is there a lonesome something? I thought there was. Well, let's go ahead and say search. No, it's there. Let's go lazy. Oh, what's up there? Something up. Let me clear it. I'll have to go and check that. I wonder if, oh, did I say company name? I'll have to check that there. But this button right here would search and filter these items here, and I'll have to double check why that's not occurring. But that allows us to do a filtering kind of capability right in the system. I notice the clear filter is reducing and refreshing this. I have to see what the lazy piece is. Let's go LMA. Try one more. I'll make sure that's hooked up there. So the other thing that's really powerful about the search or the list control is I can select a record. You'll notice that the record has been selected down here. I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom, and I'm going to change something like the address. Say Suite A. And you'll notice this Save button becomes enabled. I click Save. Now, very important, and again, it's a little hard. I would lay it out to make it a little more obvious, but two things happen. One, the synchronize button now became enabled, which says, okay, you've made a change to your local data, but now I'm ready to send it back to the backend system. The other thing it did, which is very powerful, is in the list control itself, it is telling you this record is now dirty, meaning that it is out of sync with the original data that was brought down from the backend data source. So the neat thing is I don't have to sync right now. I can update 2, 3, 4, all these records, and it's going to maintain all of that sort of local changes information. And then when I'm ready to go, the user can click synchronize, or I can do that automatically. There are a couple different ways to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and click synchronize. You'll see it's kind of going around and around for a second. Now the synchronize button is gray, and that little indicator's gone away, and you're good to go. So now the data in the current interface is identical or on the local to the backend data source. And you didn't have to write a piece of code to do that. That is all handled by the system. And there's enormous, I'm not going to go into it, but there's an enormous amount of control. There's a whole bunch of hooks in there that allow you to do checks, validations, modify data before it's synchronized. Also, you have the ability to, for instance, do actions after it's synchronized. So after everything's synchronized, maybe it updates some other fields on the user interface, but it has an enormous amount of that features that basically what you want to do, there's a way to do it within the list control there. Now, another thing that's really powerful about the system is the fact that it is doing integrity checking. And I'm not going to actually show it real quick, but I want to mention it so you know that this is happening. So for instance, let's say I'm using this lazy K and I modified the address, but someone on the back end has modified the address on the data since we pulled it down. So let's say I pulled the data down in the morning, I went out in the field, I was doing my work, someone back at the home office updated that customer record, all of a sudden I'm ready to go spin it up and synchronize it back. What you'll find is that the system will attempt to do so. It will synchronize the records it can, and then the ones it can't, it will give you a warning and allow the user to override that, or give you the links so that you can override that on your own. So the beauty of that is that it's smart enough to understand when it does synchronization to not just assume that local changes should be applied to the back end. It gives you those links and the warnings and the other things that are associated with there. Now, you'll see this kind of layout's a little difficult. You'll see that it's hard to see everything, the pieces here. So I'm going to make a few little changes to this real quick just to show you how you can edit an existing list control. So I'm going to go back into the controls, and you'll see that the heart of it is this list customers there. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And now I'm into the list control builder proper. So the previous element was the Genie for building a list control, and it does a lot of stuff, but it limits what you see. You can't really change everything. Here you can change everything, which is really, really fun. So you'll see you have a series of tabs here for your list control: data source, fields, list properties, detail view, search part, and list layout. Now, very critical is that these tabs may be different. If you don't have a detail view, you won't see this tab. If you don't see this search, you won't see that. but you will see data source, fields, and list layout. So data source is where you tell it where to go get the data to show this list control. And as we mentioned at the beginning, you have multiple variants you can use. What we set up was SQL. So you'll notice down here that because I've selected the data source type SQL, here are all the different settings for that. So for instance, the connection string, the SQL statement, all the things we kind of set up from there, what the primary key is of the backend, which is auto detected for you. And then there's a number of other things that are available down here to kind of control how the pieces go. But you're not limited to SQL. Actually, let me go through each of the fields here, and then I'll come back and talk about the other data sources, because there's a couple that I really want to point out that are very powerful from there. The second item is fields. So if you notice, we created a SQL query and we selected a series of fields to bring down into the list control. And this is going to be very important. I'm going to bring down fields, but I don't have to show them all, and I'll show you that in a moment. So if I go to fields, you'll see here are all those fields that are brought down. And it's already decided, okay, they're all character fields. That's what the little C is after that. And then you can go in now and do manipulations on a field by field basis of how it will handle it. One of the most important ones that I like to highlight right out of the gate is encrypt field. So the cool thing about that is that we can actually encrypt data that actually not we, the list control can actually encrypt data on the local device, which is very, very powerful for a number of different use cases, but even more just for the safety of that data that's locally there. So you can encrypt individual fields. You don't have to encrypt all of them, but let's say you had social security number and you absolutely didn't want anybody to be able to see that, then you can encrypt the field. It will get decrypted to show the user if they're a proper user on the app, but then the data itself is encrypted. So if someone like swipes the data off the device, they're not going to be able to read that data directly. A few other ones are display format. So if it's like a date or something like that, and then we can also determine the type of control we'd like to show when they're editing it, other pieces here. There's a lot of nuances on that, especially when you start talking about editing map information and other stuff. You can adjust that as follows. The next part is list properties. This has got a lot of settings, and this is where you would fine tune how the system works. A couple that are very interesting are, for instance, allow null selection. This allows you to say, do you always have to have a record selected in the list? Yes or no? And that's up to you. If you let this stay this way, the list could be sitting there without any item selected, or you could force that each item is selected. It really is a nuance aspect from there. And then there's a whole bunch of other items, like for instance, can I select multiple items there? What happens if there's null values come down? There's a pull to refresh behavior. So there's a lot of behavioral things that will allow you, when you're using this on a mobile device, to trap those user behaviors. The classic pull down to refresh the latest data or do synchronization, et cetera. And then they have so there's a whole host of these. This could be hours and hours walking through each one of these, but they have these capabilities within the system there. One thing I am going to come back and talk about is layouts in a moment. That's one of the most critical aspects because it really opens up an enormous amount of ways for you to use the information. Okay, so data source is where the data comes from. Fields are how you kind of manage it, tell it about it. List properties are overall behaviors of the list. And then detail view. Now, since we had a detail view, it automatically created the controls and added this tab. And basically what we do is we map, and I'm going to open this up here, the controls in the list to controls on your UX component. And that's how that wiring occurred. When I clicked on a row, you'll notice that it automatically populated the controls on the screen for me automatically because it has this mapping. And also when I said, okay, update this field and do the update, it knew, oh, okay, I'm gonna go read the value of those controls and then process that into an update on that row in the list. So all of this is handled through this detail view field map. So if you were to add a new field to the list control and to there, you would go in here. In fact, if you have a list control column without a UX, you can click a button right here and it'll create that control for you. That way you kind of say, Rev2, we're going to add 2 new fields. You just add them to the list and then come in here and add the new controls, put them on the screen. They're all wired up, ready to go. Never have to worry about from there. Okay. Now, another one which I think is very important on the detail view is remember the behavior where I edited a record, saved it, and then it put a little indicator on there and then waited for me to synchronize. Well, I can go here to this button right here or setting called synchronization policy, and I have two options here. The first one is to perform a client server synchronization. Second one is a server to client synchronization. So what this means is that this will automatically sync things for you. So for instance, if I click save and I have this enabled, the system will immediately say, okay, I'm going to save the record to the list, but now I'm going to try and synchronize that list with the backend database. So you don't have to make the user or you don't have to write code to do that. If you want, you can have other behaviors to trigger that, but this is a quick and dirty. Now, the second one does a server to client synchronization. Now, what this means is that I'm going to push my things up, but not necessarily pull things down. And that may be, it's really an architectural decision. Let's say a user goes out in the morning and you give them a set of tasks to do, they're in the list. Then all you want them to do is go out with that set of tasks, update them, update those back to the backend system. But let's say you had another user out in the field where you said, okay, I want them out in the field with an initial set of, say, tasks. And whenever they synchronize, I want to go ahead and send them any new records. And that's where the filter comes in to send it to them. So that's what this does. The issue you'll see is that doing a two-way synchronization takes a little longer because it has to send everything up, make sure everything's good, and then pull down all the stuff. So if you don't need it, you don't want to enable it. And that's really a decision you have for your architecture. So I'm going to go ahead and enable both of them just for this demo, but that's good to go there. So that's called synchronization policy. Again, the beauty of that, don't have to worry about managing that synchronization. Your user doesn't have to worry about it. You can literally get rid of that button and you're good to go from there. Now, there's a number of other pieces here. You can talk about the table, what you can do in it. So you can do like fine control stuff. So you can say, is it read only? Can you even edit it? Can you insert, update, delete? So like say, you know what? No way, nobody can delete from here. I can turn it off. So therefore the delete functionality will not work. Now, if I have a delete button on there, I have to get rid of it. But those are the kind of things you can do here. The other thing that's really nice is that if you have security enabled, you can set up groups saying only these type of users can insert, update, or delete. So if you've done alpha, you're very familiar with security groups and the fact on fields and on grids and stuff like that, you can fine tune that based on their security policy. The list control manages that same thing. It allows you to say they can update, delete, etc. from there. And as I mentioned before, the neat thing about the list control, especially as you start using it and you find different cases where you want to take a little bit more control, you'll see that there's a whole series of server-side events that says what happens before you do an insert or an update. So in here, you can put in stuff to like set initial values, make some calculations before they insert it, etc. And even if you have a SQL execute error, you can trap that and handle it from your standpoint. And one I think is very important are these down here. One is you can geocode a record. So let's say someone types in a address into your form. You can actually literally have it geocode that into a lat long as you do it. So the system will do that for you. This is very, very handy for remote sort of mobile applications. The other is you can store the location information from the record when it is saved. So when the record is saved, you can actually grab the current lat long and insert that with it so that you know exactly where that record was saved. And to give you an example of that, we have a client who's a lifeguard company, and they have created an alpha solution that's sitting with a lifeguard, and the lifeguard needs to update information. Well, what they want to make sure happen is that they're actually at the pool when they're doing the update. They can actually trap and record that information so someone isn't sitting at the Starbucks updating their logs when they're supposed to be at the pool. So those are kind of geofencing kind of capabilities that are built into the system. And the neat thing about it is no code is necessary for you. You just enable them and map them to the fields in your database. Alpha will do the rest. So this is the, that's the detail view aspect. As we mentioned, the search part, this is where you set up the different controls and the other pieces. Not sure how that, I'll have to go ahead and check why that didn't work there. And then finally, and I apologize, it took me a while to get here, is the list layout. And the list layout is now the sort of the display part. all of these items right here talk about how to handle the list control. This one down here now says, okay, what do I actually display on the screen? So as you can see, in this case, it's selected and displayed everything. But let's say I just want to display a few items. I can actually move them over here. They're still in the list control, and the list control will still manage that data. But these are the only things that are going to be displayed in my list. So I'll go in and just do a quick display of that and show you. Now the list control is going to be a little, yep. So you can see it's responsive. So the list control takes up the whole screen and it's spread everything out. But now you can see there's only those columns that I've selected there from that standpoint. All the other wiring, everything else works fine within the system there. And so let's go back. A couple other things I want to show you real quick, and then we'll open it up for questions. As I mentioned before, one of the most powerful things about the list control is this list layout capability. So I can go in here and modify everything, my headers, what coloring I have. I can have even a template. You can do sorting. Basically, this allows you to fine tune what the user sees on the screen and allow you to set that up. And there's an enormous amount of capability built into it. Even things like right-clicking on the column type, you can capture that there. Now, what I want to show you, which is really, really powerful, is something really nice. So I'm going to go back to list properties. And I'm going to scroll down here, and I'm going to go down to here where it says has multiple layouts. Oh, by the way, before I go into it, you can put in a navigator. So like one of the nice things about the grid is that down below, it'll say page 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. List controls kind of scroll all the way down because they're kind of meant more for mobile. But if you want to use it on a desktop web and you want to have like only show 20 records and then have the navigator down below, all of that is built into the list navigator capability. I won't be demonstrating it, but just to let you know it's there. So I'm going to say, yes, I do want multiple layouts. Okay. So now I have added multiple layouts, and you can see right here, there's a new tab that's been added calling multiple layouts. And if I go there, there's one called default, which is right here. So when I am on default, if I go to list property or list layout, this is what it's done. So I'm going to go back to multiple layouts. I'm going to add a new one, and I'm just going to call it test. And I'm going to come back to the different type here, but I'm just going to call it a column. Okay, so now I have a new layout here called column. If I go to list layout, let me go back to multiple layouts here. I can select that, and then I can edit that layout. So I can go to my list layout, go down here, and I can say, do I use default or to use test? And the cool thing about it is I can say, okay, I want these two here. And so we're going to do test. So I'm going to show you a second here. When I do the working preview, you're going to go, wait a minute, nothing changed. You can say, oh, that looks like the first one. Notice it's got 4 columns, but I can go back in the list of customers, go to the multi-layout, and in here, I can tell it which one is the default layout. So I want test to be the default layout. So now when the list first loads up, it does all its own stuff, and then it's going to say, which layout should I use? And there's my layout, which is the customer ID and the company name. So you can create multiple layouts for your list control depending on what the user is doing, but you don't have to create multiple list controls. And on the fly, you can change that with either JavaScript or with a control that you can add that will, it's a drop-down control that says what layouts are available, what would the user use. It's pretty cool. Now, the reason I show you this is layouts are incredibly powerful, and I will show you now why they are. So you'll remember when I created that new layout. So let's create a new layout here. And we'll call this new. I have different types of layouts. So I have a column, which is what you've been seeing so far. I have freeform, which is sort of like the view box where I go in there and I can just use HTML and do what's called JSON templating, where I can literally just put in some JSON, HTML and CSS, and that's what will be displayed on the screen. And Alpha is smart enough with once you put in the fields, it'll merge that together. And that's really powerful if you're trying to match an existing design or do something interesting, you can just use that methodology here. You can also do Kanban. So that's I'm sure almost everybody's used to it, but the classic, you've got a number of columns and then you have boxes in each columns. That is fully enabled. And there's a whole series on that actually in our webinars on how to set those up. And the cool thing about them is that they're directly related to the database. So if I like move something from one column to another, I can update that status and it will write back to the database, and it takes care of all that for you. There's a little bit more setup with Kanban because of the way it works. So there's just, you'll need to go through kind of the step-by-step. It's not hard, but it's a little bit more than just setting up a new column or layout, but it works really good. Custom allows me to do everything from scratch. Don't really use that a whole lot because all these others are so powerful. We can also use a mapping one where the information, like, if you have Latin lawns and things like that, that can be displayed in a map representation. And the cool thing about that, and this is really powerful about the map one, which I love, is the fact that it can change the icons on the map and the coloring and a whole bunch of other stuff based on the data in your database. So once you've set up that mapping, if you change your database in the database and then sync it down, the user will get a new map with a whole new set of kind of feel with that information, those pointers on the map, and it's really, really powerful there. And last but not least is the charting capability. This allows you to display charts in there. This is fairly new, it's newer, and I haven't really used it a whole lot, but it's an alternative to use the other charting methodology to chart your data. And again, very, very important, chart data is tied to the underlying data. So for instance, once you've set up your data, you can chart that data. When you get a new set of data down, it will update the charts appropriately and do the other pieces from there. And there's a lot of control over how you can modify these, tweak them, make them do everything you do. Now, the other thing that's nice about that is that all of these work off of local data. So for instance, if the user is offline, these controls will still work, present the data. You can drag and drop, do whatever you want to do, and it'll update the data there. And then we use the built-in synchronization function in the list control to then synchronize that data back up to the backend system. So really nice is you can basically, the person in the morning can download their data, have a whole sets of charts to review them. And then if they get updates, those charts will change, other ways from there. So multiple layouts are really nice because you don't have to create different list controls to say, oh, I want to show them in column, now I want to show them Kanban, whatever it happens to be. You can create one list control and show those columns from there, or show the different type from there. Another thing that's really powerful is that, and this is more advanced, you can actually create different sort of, let's say I had a wide and a narrow layout, I can actually tie that to detecting when the device changes orientation. So if I'm in portrait with a mobile phone, I will get one layout, and if I change it to horizontal, or I guess landscape mode, it will automatically update that and pick that layout and show it to the user. So that is really cool when you do mobile stuff, because you don't have to worry about that. You set up this layouts for this kind of scenario, off to the races, or give your users the ability to modify the layout with a drop-down box. All that is capability. So layouts, as we talked about, the data management side is huge, but also there's a very rich environment that allows you to modify the look and feel and the presentation of data. Very sophisticated maps, Kanban, charts that are beyond just columns and rows like a traditional, and it's all built into this one control. So you could literally, spend tons of time learning the list control and really not even uncover all of the capabilities that are built into it. It's pretty staggering in terms of what it can do. And beyond that, and I'm not going to go in that today, as I mentioned before, and let me go over to here, data sources, you can bring the data down from different ways. We're using a SQL database, but you're not limited to that. You could literally get a JavaScript function and get that information. So for instance, let's say you're on a phone and you're collecting data locally, you could literally call a JavaScript function that will reach out, get some data, and then bring it back and present it into it. You could connect to Alpha Transform. So if you would like to grab data out of Alpha Transform and present that to users in like a dashboard or so, you can do that. You can literally point to an Excel file, a CSV file, a JSON file, and those could just be static files that are available and display them from there. And so incredible amount of capabilities. One I like a lot is the custom one, which I've used before. Basically what I do is I call an XBasic function. That XBasic function actually generates the data I need. So I can actually pull from multiple sources and bring it down in one fell swoop, which is pretty good. And you can even do static. Upload some static data, stick it into the list, it stays the same. Let's say it's a directory or something like that, doesn't change, then you can just put that information from there. So it's super, super powerful in terms of how you can connect these backend sources and be able to handle it from there. So data management, ability to load it with many, many different sources of data, and the ability for fine-tuned control of the user interface and ability to show multiple different views to a user. As you can see, there's a lot here. And again, if you're going to do mobile, this is your go-to because all of the mobile capabilities is built into the system, so you don't have to deal from that standpoint there. So I'm going to put I've gone through a ton of stuff. The goal was just kind of give you a feel for the list control, what's there, what can be done with it. I want to open it up for questions and see if anybody has any questions, and we can kind of go from there.
Excellent. Yes, we do have a few questions. As a matter of fact, let's start back here at the beginning. One was one that you had already, that you did in fact answer, but I thought it was a good enough question that was worth repeating. And that was, if you have a database that has like a bazillion records in it, right? And you've got a mobile device that's got a list control on it, and you don't want to bring down everything. You want that list to be blank to start with before you do a search to filter down what you're looking for. What is the option for doing that in the list control?
Well, if you're using the search, you would go to the search part and do the delay populate list.
Thank you.
If you're setting up from the get-go, again, that SQL query is important because in here you can set up filters. And those filters can be driven by arguments on the controls. So for instance, you could have information about their division or their sub company or something like that and use that information behind the scenes to limit the amount of data that comes down to it. Now, even if you have an enormous amount of data, and this depends, if you're doing offline, you got to take into account how much space you have. If you're doing this as a list control in a browser, there are certain memory limitations where the browser will just say no more. And I think it's 25 megs, which is actually a fair amount of data. But if you're going to try and synchronize images or image data, that's going to run out really, really fast because it's just, a ton of data for each image. But if you're doing textual stuff, you can actually get a fair amount. Now, when you're on a mobile device and you've wrapped it into a mobile device, into an app, then you're not going to have as many, because these mobile devices have gigs of space. And since we're using the local file system versus the browser, it opens up an enormous amount of space that's available from there. So really the idea is, again, I always say filter first, really try to get it down to just what information they need out in the field, not everything in your database. Filter it from the get-go, and then you go there. By the way, you can do stuff also is, let's say it's not necessarily a search, but you want them to do a few things and then bring the data down. You have the ability to say, for instance, delay render till visible or explicit refresh. Visible is like, I'm not on the home page, but it's 3 pages in. Don't go load that data until they actually go look at the list. So therefore, you get better load performance. As far as explicit refresh, this is where you can say, don't actually load the data or refresh that data until I tell you to. And the beauty of that, and just to show you, is that I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to add another button here. And I'll go test. And the neat thing about the button is there is in action JavaScript, there's list control actions. In here are like a bajillion things you can do with the list. So, and it's all action JavaScript, so you don't have to write any of your own JavaScript. The system will do it. Things like just saying, when I click this button, refresh the data. Or when I do this, just refresh a row. Or when I do this, remove all rows from a list. All these kind of things here. So what's nice is even things as sophisticated as export the list data to Excel or ASCII, boom, built into it. You don't have to do that from there. Or I want to import that data from Excel or ASCII. So the action JavaScript allows you to really tell the list what to do, so the list doesn't make these decisions for you. You can fine tune and control that, especially if you have large data sets or you want to really narrow it down so that you don't overwhelm the user with a lot of data, you're able to do it. One other note I want to say too about this is the following. So if I go back to the list control, the list control also has a lot of features. I think it's in this one right here. Okay, so the list control, there it is right here. It has what's called virtualization. So what virtualization does is that you can dynamically virtualize it. So literally it speeds up the process. If you do have a lot of records you need to be able to give the person, you can, do this so it kind of lazy loads it and it doesn't, like, if you think about it, what it's doing is creating a whole bunch of HTML. It brings down and creates it so when they scroll to it, they see they're basically scrolling HTML data. With dynamic, it's smart enough to like create some HTML, then re-render it on the go as they navigate through the records. The other area too here is if you have a list navigator, you can go in here. Is it no, wait, I'm sorry. Let me go back here. It's has scroller. Nope, not scroller. I'm looking for, maybe it is, wait. You can actually tell it to load up a certain amount of data. Let's go ahead and dynamic. Here we go. Okay. So in this, you can say, for instance, just load 50 records at a time and then dynamically load the other records that they need. So the idea is that it's not going to try and download 2,000 records. It'll just get the first 50 and show them, and then they can use like a pull to pull more data. So there's some techniques and capability built into list virtualization that allows you to sort of improve the behavior and sort of user experience, but also more importantly is not overwhelm your target area within it. So
Cool. Awesome. Thanks very much.
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, apologize asking an engineer what time it is, and they'll tell you how to build a watch. So
Thanks,
I know,
Dan.
but I hope that gives a little more pointers on that. Yeah.
Yeah. So now the next question is actually an opposite question. What if you've got a list control, you've hooked it up to a table, and that table has no records in it at all? Does it still function? And can you add a new record? Can you put that first record into the table from a list control?
Absolutely. So when it synchronizes, it knows the structure of that data source. So even if that data source has no information in it, it still knows its structure. So it knows how to create a new thing. Even as something powerful as on that database table, there's a column called ID, which is auto numbered. It's smart enough to say, oh, okay, I'm not going to try and create an ID and shove it in there. I'm going to let that, and then when I get that ID, pull it back and do it. So all of that has been thought out for you. Now, one nice little feature is that let's say you have a list control with no records, you can put here has no records list, click there and say,
And you could just define what it says. Yeah.
Tasks, whatever the content is, you say no tasks are available.
Yeah.
But then when you go to the detail view, if you've hooked it up with the buttons, and I'll just go ahead and go out here, this new record is available. They can just click new record and it will basically empty out this field, allow you to update. When you click save, it will then save that into the list. If you've got auto sync on, it's going to go ahead and push that record up to the database. You have a new record in there. So there's no inherent issues with having an empty data source that it needs to interact with, especially a database. It will handle that. And you can control it so that the person doesn't say, oh, it's broken, it's blank. You want to actually put a little message in there saying no records, please click new to start the process or to create your first record, things like that.
Cool, thank you. This is a question we get from time to time. It's a good one, and that is, can you configure it or can you set up Alpha Anywhere to automatically synchronize when a connection is active?
Correct, yes, you can. You can set up I believe, I wonder if that's in here or synchronization policy. You would set, I know what I do. Okay. In the UX, there are, where is that? I think it's under properties. There's something called on timer. And it has an on timer event. And you can enable this and periodically run a sync, see if there's a piece of JavaScript that says, is the server available? You say yes, then it would go ahead and synchronize it. So that's one method, and that'll just be on a time basis. I think there is another method, and I'd have to remember on that, where it auto detects if the server is available and tells you whether it's online or offline. And if it's online, it tries to do something. I think that's in, if I'm not mistaken, let me go to the JavaScript functions, go into here. And we'll go on. So there's a number of things here saying, is server available? And it basically does this. So it looks at it and then says, yes, if it does, then go ahead and do something. You can also use get online status just to see if there's a connection to the server. So
Mhm.
between these two things, you can set up a timer that is checking to see if the server's available and then pings it. Because you don't want to be like just permanently connected, because you may not be permanently connected. And more importantly, you don't want to try and do a synchronization if you're offline, because it will just fail. By the way, if it tries to do that, you can give a very user-friendly saying, oh, your records are safe. We just weren't able to synchronize that. We'll try again in 5 minutes or when you're next
Right.
connected. There's also another thing which is important, called, I think it's connection type. So let's say you do have a ton of data. Well, and this is becoming less of an issue with the advent of LTE and, more important, 5G. In fact, 5G is faster than a lot of home stuff. You could detect whether you're on Ethernet, Wi-Fi, or like 2G or 3G or whatever it happens to be. And then you could say, well, if I'm on Wi-Fi, go ahead and synchronize. If I'm not, wait till I get a Wi-Fi signal, because I know it's going to take a long time. But again, that's kind of a moot point. I mean, you'd have to have a lot of data. And the reality is, with modern networks, you're pretty much online all the time, good or bad, that may be. So again, for those kind of behaviors, you just use a little JavaScript, use that on timer event. It doesn't cost any performance penalty, and therefore it can sit there and just say, oh yeah, I realized I have a connection. I'm going to go ahead and synchronize. And then once it's done, it waits and tries later on, kind of scenario. Or you could even put in your code saying wait for an hour after it synchronizes, because you don't want to try every 5 seconds, but it will loop through there every 5 seconds or every 10 seconds to say, is it time for me to try and check and see if I should sync? So that's pretty easy code. And I think we do have a webinar where I actually walk through the use of these.
That's right.
Yeah, we did a whole webinar on it. And if you go through there, we go through and show some samples where we highlight icons, non-highlight them when we're offline, and all those kind of things. It shows you some of those tricks there. It might save you a little time.
Cool. Next question, and this is back in the list builder. It has to do with on the fields tab. So if we can open that up. There is an option called add item. And someone's saying, well, what is that? Can you actually add a
Good point.
field to your, yeah.
Okay, so these are the fields that came back from the SQL data source, but sometimes you want to have like a button on each row. So you can add a button or a hyperlink or an image, whether it be static or dynamic. So this allows you to add your own fields that you can add on your layouts. And when you add those things, then you can add, like, link it to some JavaScript or some action JavaScript to do some things. One
They're
that's
not
really,
connected
really
to
cool.
fields in a database, right? Because that's separate. But these are just
Yeah,
things
these are
that aren't fields in the database. Yeah.
correct.
Like pictures.
I'm not sure virtual JavaScript, I haven't understand that, but we can also put little drop-down menus, which is really cool. And you can also show a chart also next to it as a column in your thing. The one I like, and actually the one I probably use a lot from that, I mainly use buttons and images, just because that's a way to take action on a specific row. I can click on it and say, do something with that. But the custom control allows you to write a little piece of XBasic. And so I've had scenarios where I want to take information on each row and merge it, modify it, change it, and then display something. And that's really powerful, because essentially you can infinitely create. And all it does is run a little bit of XBasic. You generate HTML, give it back to it, and it displays that HTML for you. And that could include images and other things. So that was kind of cool, because, like, for instance, you could take 3 or 4 rows, merge their data together, modify it, show it to the user, and you just get a really fine-tuned control over that, and it's really easy. So that's custom control. But most often you use it for buttons and images to add interactive behaviors.
Very cool.
Good question.
So someone said, can the data source for your list, can that be Windows ODBC?
If it is a yes, you can set up a in your application.
Connection strings.
Yeah, you go to the connection string, new, and we have, where is it? ODBC, right there. So you can set up an ODBC connection string and let Alpha do all the work for you, and it has all the inspection and everything else there. Some other cool ones that are cool is Alpha Cloud SQL Database. SharePoint, actually, just to let everybody know, a lot of work is done in the last few months on connecting to SharePoint for both, like, document saving and also connecting to it. So that's in there. And we can also do things, which also a lot of work has been done, of connecting to the no JSON world of, like, MongoDB. So again, including this new one called Foundation DB. Not even sure what that is. Is that something cool new or something I should know?
We're always adding. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I know. It's like, someone read an article somewhere.
We're out of time, but
Okay.
sadly not out of questions. So the questions we didn't get to, if you want to send them over to guides, GUIDES at alphasoftware.com, we'll be happy to get back to you. Dion, thank you very much for presenting today. Appreciate it.
My
Thank you, Sarah,
pleasure.
for being
That was a
here,
great time.
helping us out behind the scenes. We hope to see you at our next Wednesday webinar. Until then, stay well and take care. Bye-bye.